Hey everyone, welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And today we're looking at early childhood education, specifically some guidelines from NAEYC about making good decisions when you're working with young learners.
Right.
They lay out 3 core considerations, almost like foundational pillars for anyone working with young children. Have you ever wondered what really makes certain approaches to early childhood education so effective? Well, get ready to discover the secret sauce.
I am excited to unpack these with you. NAEYC uses terms like commonality, individuality, and context. They might seem simple at first glance, but there's a surprising amount of depth to each of these considerations.
Okay, so let's start with commonality. I think most people would assume this is about recognizing the typical patterns of development and learning we see in all children, right?
You're exactly right. It's about understanding those general milestones kids tend to go through. But here's the catch. Much of the traditional research in child development has been focused on a very specific group, often reflecting a Western middle-class perspective. So we have to be mindful of that when we're working with children from diverse backgrounds. In fact, there's some really fascinating research emerging as challenges some of our long-held assumptions about child development.
That's interesting. Can you give us an example?
Well, for a long time,
Yeah.
the dominant view was that children develop in a linear stage-like progression. But more recent research suggests that development is much more dynamic and fluid than we originally thought.
So it's not just a straight line from point A to point B.
Exactly. It's more like a winding path with lots of twists and turns. And every child navigates that path in their own unique way. It's important to remember that. Assuming everyone develops in exactly the same way can lead to misunderstandings or even missed opportunities when we're working with kids.
That makes a lot of sense. It sounds like we need to be really careful about making assumptions, especially when we're working with children from different cultures or backgrounds.
Absolutely. And that brings us to another important point. Development and learning don't happen in a vacuum. A child's social and cultural context plays a huge role in how they speak, learn, and grow. Think about things like cultural norms, family traditions, even community values. Those all factor into the equation.
It's like they're bringing their whole world with them, this classroom.
Exactly. And even something as universal as play can look very different depending on a child's background.
You know, that reminds me of something I read in the NAEYC guidelines. It said, play, however, can vary significantly by social and cultural contexts as children use play as a means of interpreting and making sense of their experiences. It's interesting to think about how those experiences shape how they learn and play.
It really highlights the importance of understanding and valuing those differences and how that understanding can lead to more effective and meaningful learning experiences for each child.
Okay, so we've talked about commonality in terms of those shared developmental patterns, but we also have to remember that each child brings their own unique set of strengths, experiences, and even challenges to the table, which leads us to the next core consideration. Individuality, right?
Yes, and this isn't just some warm and fuzzy idea. It has real practical implications for how we approach education. It goes beyond just recognizing that every child is different. We need to move towards truly understanding each child as an individual.
So what does that look like in practice? How can we as educators really grasp each child's individuality?
I think one of the most important things is careful observation, really watching and listening to the child. What are their interests? How do they approach learning? What are their strengths and challenges?
It sounds like building a strong relationship with each child is crucial.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of communication with families. No one knows a child better than their family. Partnering with families gives us invaluable insights into a child's individual needs and preferences.
The NAEYC guidelines actually have a really powerful passage that gets at this. Concept of individuality, it says. These differences include the children's various social identities, interests, strengths, and preferences, their personalities, motivations, and approaches to learning, and their knowledge, skills, and abilities related to their cultural experiences, including family languages, dialects, and vernaculars.
That really drives the point home. We're talking about a whole constellation of factors that contribute to each child's unique identity and learning journey. And as educators, it's our responsibility to understand and honor that individuality.
I completely agree. So if I'm picturing this correctly, we have commonality, which is like the broad framework
for development. And then we layer in individuality to understand the unique way that development unfolds in each child.
That's a great way to think about it. But there's one more piece to this puzzle, and it might be the most important of all: context.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more. This is all about understanding the bigger picture, the web of influences that surrounds both the child and the educator.
So it's not just about the child's context.
Right. It's about recognizing that we, as educators, also bring our own experiences and biases to the table. Everyone has a unique lens through which they view the world, shaped by their own background, culture, and beliefs. And that lens can influence how we interact with children, especially those from cultures different from our own.
So I can see how it could be a blind spot if we're not aware of it.
Exactly. That's why this self-awareness, recognizing our own context, both personal and cultural, is so crucial. It helps us be more sensitive, more inclusive, and ultimately more effective in our teaching.
The NAUIC guide puts it really well. Early childhood educators must also be aware that they themselves and their programs as a whole bring their own experiences and contexts in both the narrower and broader definitions to their decision-making. It's a powerful reminder that we're not just teaching in a vacuum. We're part of a larger system, and understanding that system helps us make better decisions for the children we work with them.
You hit the nail on the head. Recognizing these different contexts helps us tailor our approach. Be more sensitive to a child's cultural background, create a more inclusive environment, and avoid unintentionally perpetuating biases.
This is giving me a lot to think about, it seems like. These three core considerations: commonality, individuality, and context, work together to create a much more holistic and nuanced approach to early childhood education.
You're absolutely right. It's like we have these different lenses to view the child and their learning journey, and using all three lenses gives us a much richer understanding of how to support their growth.
This is really fascinating stuff. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground already, but I'm eager to dive deeper into these concepts and explore how we can put them into practice.
I'm with you. There's so much more to uncover.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork with those core considerations. Now, how do these concepts actually play out in real-life classroom situations?
Well, think about it this way. Imagine you're a preschool teacher, planning a lesson on shapes. When you consider commonality, most kids in this age group are starting to grasp the basic shapes, like circles and squares.
Right, but then individuality comes in, and you realize some kids might already know their shapes, while others are just starting to explore them. Wouldn't that make teaching a bit more challenging?
It does. But that's where context adds another layer. Maybe you have a child who comes from a culture where geometric patterns are a big part of their art and architecture. You could tap into that background to create a more engaging learning experience.
So instead of just using standard shape blocks, you might incorporate examples of those patterns into the lesson.
Exactly. You're tailoring the experience to the individual child's context while still building on those common developmental milestones.
This is making me think about how we assess young children, too. Does this change how we approach assessments?
Absolutely. Traditional assessments like standardized tests can be very limiting, especially when we think about individuality and context. They don't always capture the unique ways children learn and express their knowledge.
So we need to move away from that one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. We need more authentic methods that take the whole child into account. Things like observing them in the classroom, looking at portfolios of their work, or even just having conversations with their families. These give us a much richer and more holistic understanding of each child's progress than a standardized test ever could.
It's about seeing the child as a whole person, not just a test score, but doesn't focusing on individuality and context. Make things more time-consuming for teachers. I mean, how can they realistically do all of this for every single child in a busy classroom?
That's a valid concern. It does require a shift in mindset and maybe some adjustments to how we structure our classrooms and our time. But ultimately, I think it's an investment that pays off in the long run. When children feel seen and understood, when their individual needs are met, they're more likely to thrive. And that makes everyone's job easier in the long run.
Okay, I can see that. But I'm curious, are there any potential downsides to focusing so much on context? Could we inadvertently reinforce stereotypes or make assumptions about a child based on their background?
That's a really important point. We always have to be mindful of our own biases and make sure we're not making assumptions about a child based on their cultural background or any other factor. Context is about understanding, not labeling. It's about using that knowledge to create a more supportive and responsive learning environment. And that requires ongoing reflection and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Oh, it's a delicate balance.
It is. But it's a balance worth striving for. When we get it right, the benefits for children are immeasurable.
This whole conversation is making me think about how we can create more inclusive learning environments for all children.
Inclusivity goes hand in hand with these core considerations. When we understand commonality, individuality, and context, we're better equipped to create classrooms where everyone feels welcome and respected.
So it's about more than just having diverse books and toys in the classroom.
Exactly. It's about creating a culture of respect and belonging for everyone. It involves everything from the way we communicate with children to the activities we choose to the physical layout of the classroom.
I'm starting to see how these core considerations are not just about teaching. They're about creating a whole ethos for early childhood education.
They are. They provide a framework for thinking about how we interact with children, how we design our curriculum, and how we assess their progress.
This is powerful stuff, and I bet it has huge implications, not only for the child's immediate learning, but also for their long-term development.
You're absolutely right. When children feel seen and understood, when their individual needs are met, they're more likely to thrive academically, socially, and emotionally.
This deep dive is really making me rethink my whole approach to working with young children. It's like we've been given a whole new set of lenses to see the world through.
And that's the beauty of it. These core considerations aren't just abstract concepts. They're practical tools that can help us become better educators and create a more just and equitable world for all children.
I love that. This has been such an insightful discussion. I feel like we could go on for hours, but I think it's time to wrap things up.
I agree. Let's leave our listeners with some final thoughts to ponder.
Okay, we're back, and I feel like my brain is buzzing with all these ideas about commonality, individuality, and context in early childhood education.
It's a lot to take in, but it's so important for Kitty. Anyone working with young children to have this framework in mind.
Absolutely. It's like we've uncovered this secret recipe for creating truly effective and enriching learning experiences for kids. So for all of you listening out there, what's the one thing you want them to take away
from this deep dive?
If I had to choose just one thing, it's this. Every child deserves an education that truly honors their individuality, their unique strengths, and their learning style. But we can't do that in isolation. We have to consider those common developmental patterns, the child's unique context, and yes, even our own biases. As educators,
it's like we're all pieces of a puzzle.
Yeah.
And each piece is essential.
I love that analogy. And when we approach early childhood education with this mindset, a mindset that values both the individual and the collective, we create a world where every child has the opportunity.
You drive.
So thinking about everything we've discussed, what's one question you'd like to leave our listeners with? Something to really make them think about the implications of these core considerations.
This is a big one, but I think it's worth pondering. How can we use these principles of commonality, individuality, and context to create early learning environments that are truly equitable for all children, especially those from marginalized communities? How can we ensure that every child, regardless of their background, has the opportunity to reach their full potential?
That's a powerful question. It really challenges us to look beyond our individual classrooms and consider the systemic factors that influence a child's educational journey. It's a call to action for all of us to advocate for policies and practices that promote equity and inclusion in early childhood education.
Wow, steep dive has given us a lot to think about.
It has. But I hope it's also given our listeners a renewed sense of hope and inspiration. Because when we approach early childhood education with intention, with sensitivity, and with a deep understanding of these core considerations, we have the power to make a real difference in the lives of children. Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. To all of you listening, keep those minds curious, keep exploring, and keep advocating for the well-being of all children.
Until next time, happy learning.